And I think as things are now, you have to just tap Got It, click on Got It on your screens at your end, just to accept that that we're recording. So our usual ground rules apply for this. Don't wait to the end if you have anything that you want to raise or discuss or share or ask as it comes up. Just open your mic or stick your hand up on the probably open your mic is the easiest, because I don't always spot the hands up on the Zoom, especially when I'm screen sharing, because everybody's on quite small screens. So just feel free to stop me and ask or share anything as we go through. Little drawing activity this morning just to get us warmed up a little bit. So what we've got here is the thing called the blob tree. We used to use this a lot in days gone by, but I haven't used it for a good number of years. The idea is to grab a pen from the bottom of the screen and draw a little circle around the blob character who most represents how you're feeling this morning. And so you can see, you can see lots of different characters on there, the blob family, who are sort of all getting involved in different things. There's some happy ones, some unhappy ones, some scared ones, some sleepy ones, some helping others ones, some angry ones, some climbing up the tree ones, some running away to join another group ones. So we're not going to share these, so it's just purely for you to see how you're feeling this morning. We used to use these a lot on paper and just get students to hand them back in, or just to keep them and then reflect on them again at the end of the lesson. And it's really just so that the beauty of doing it really in Nearpod is that I can get sort of a feeling for how everybody is everybody's feeling this morning. Oh, 10 out of 10 for colouring in, Paul. Okay, fantastic. I think this is widely available around the college. Ask around if it is copyrighted. So I think you have to pay if you download it. It's something like 50p, and then it's kind of unlimited use. But there are copies around if you ever feel like using it. It's just getting the students really to reflect on where they're at the beginning of the lesson, and see if you then do it through Nearpod, you can get an idea. It's an anonymous way, really, of the students just kind of letting the teacher know what kind of mood they're in this morning. And of course, mood is one of the things that can affect how well we do or don't learn. The blob tree. Okay, wonderful, thank you. Now we've got a little quiz. Again, this is going to be anonymous, so please ensure that you answer as honestly as possible. And the question that we've got here is, how confident do you feel to ask a question about something you don't understand in front of this class? It's the very thing that I've just asked you to do.
Gary, the previous one wasn't anonymous. We could actually see everybody else's answers on your screen.
Ah, yes, that's because I'm sharing screen, isn't it? Yeah, yes, of course. That's a very good point, Caroline. Thank you. Yeah, I can't. Yeah, there's no, unless I take the screen share down in between. Let me switch to student view, or yeah, because then I've got no way of seeing the answers. Let me stop my screen share. That's the best way of doing that, isn't it? Thanks for that, Caroline. I hadn't, yeah, of course, this doesn't life get complicated.
I don't mind if you see my answers, it's fine.
Yeah, well, we're a caring, sharing sort of group, but okay. So I've taken the screen share down now, so that we can't see the answers. Okay, so we've got responses from everybody there. And just before we have a look at that, we'll go on to another one, similar sort of question. And this time it's, how confident do you feel to disagree with me in front of everybody else in the group? So I'm sort of delivering something on a subject, you think I'm completely wrong and you want to disagree with me. How would you feel about doing that? And the reason behind these questions will become apparent as we work through the material. Okay, great. So I'm just going to go back to the previous question and share the results. It's not sharing as I'd hoped it would. What can you see at your end?
You can see a pie chart.
You can just see a pie chart, okay.
With the values for the pie chart as well.
Right, okay, but without names, Caroline?
No, no names.
No, that's right, okay. I can't see that my end. Okay, so yes, we're looking at that. That's nice to read in actual fact. It would depend, I think, on the diversity that we had in the group and the cultural background of the individuals that we had in the group, and we'll see how that applies at the moment there. So we've got most people falling into the quite confident to ask a question, and one with no problem at all. Then if we do the same with the second question, if we have a look at that, we've got some who are not that confident, most falling into the quite confident, and again one into the no problem with that. But again, it's a reasonable variation. You've got variation across three different responses there, and I suspect with an even more diverse group that would change again, and we'll see why we're doing this further down the line. So if we just go back now to screen sharing again, if somebody could just confirm that that's sharing okay for me. Wonderful, thank you. So just spend, if you've got pen and paper in front of you, just spend a couple of minutes maybe jotting down some thoughts. Again, this is not going to be shared, it's just your personal thoughts about what the word inclusion in terms of education and teaching and learning, what inclusion means to you. We'll have a couple of minutes on that. In actual fact, the jottings that you're putting down now could be used as one of your reflections, one of your journal reflections later on. We've had a minute and a half now. And there we go. That's our 2 minutes up. So if you leave that task for the moment, and we'll revisit that at the end of the session and see if our views have changed or we've added to anything, or whether we got it pretty much how we thought we were going to see it at the end as well. Okay, so here's some views from some other people. Quite important view here from Ofsted as they make judgments about our inclusion. So there's 3 sort of captures I've got there from the Ofsted manual for their inspectors. A few of the points to pull out there, I think, about the students engaging deeply in the breadth of college life. And obviously this year is the first year for many, many years that we've had the Wednesdays set aside for the for additional sort of learning, where students from all over the college can begin to join in the various events and activities that we have running in the college in order to sort of broaden their education beyond the subject specific areas. That's something, you know, that the college used to do a lot. There were book clubs, there were clubs that put on plays, there were film clubs, football, netball, cricket, all sorts of things used to go on, and they were very, very well attended. And we lost those for about 8 or 9 years, I suppose. We've stopped doing that. We've brought that back again. Ofsted considers that to be very important. And at the moment, I think we're getting somewhere in the region of 56% of students who are engaging with that. Obviously, one of the limitations that we have is having 2 campuses, one of which, of course, is being very small, and a limited amount of things that we can offer in terms of additional courses. But it's about engaging in the college life is one of the things that Ofsted looks at, valuing diversity and the contributions. And then the other one that I've emboldened and italicized is the removing barriers, because that is a theme that comes up in many people's definition of what inclusion is, the removal of barriers, things that get in the way of people achieving and learning. So this is from Ofsted. This is a couple of other comments there, one from a focus group and one from the HE Professional Standards Framework. I think the 2 key things to pull out of those 2 are that everyone belongs. In the top one, everyone belongs. There's a sense of belonging there, and that diversity is valued. And again, from the bottom one, there's this removal of barriers. It's got the fact there that anticipates. So in other words, planning, that's your initial assessment and diagnostics up front, that we identify any potential barriers before we discover them, anticipate and remove any barriers that learners might have. One here from Rita Pearson, which we love her videos, the late Rita Pearson, that every child deserves a champion. An adult never gives up on them, understands the power of connection and relationships, and encourages them to be the best they can be. From Rita Pearson. And our good friend Jeff Petty. Was his approach, one of his approaches to feedback is his medal and mission approach. Jeff Petty actually goes beyond this statement in one of his presentations and in his books to say that, you know, inclusion is really, it's an organizational approach. So part of inclusion needs to be that the college has to have policies around inclusion. There needs to be differentiation of the learning. Diversity needs to be promoted as a positive aspect in learning. We need to ensure that there's equality of access to learning and assessment. There's that removing barriers again, and that the learning should be personalised. So that then brings us to our 4 steps to success for today. What is meant by inclusion? I think there's so many different definitions of it. We need to come to our own sort of interpretation and understanding of it. And I think if you ask probably in 6 months, in a year's time, what is meant by inclusion, that definition will change again, potentially. Importantly, we need to know what we need to do for this unit, the assessment requirements of Unit 8, and that's what we're going to focus on next. What I'd like you to do is to be open with your ideas and support each other. Relate everything to your own practice. So when you're writing up this assignment, if you can relate to students that you have worked or are currently working with, that makes your assignment work so much more rich and valuable, and eliminates that any doubt or question around plagiarism, which is a constant concern in education. That if you're talking about your own students, we know that this is your work without question. And it just makes for me, for the IQA, the EQA, a much more interesting read if we know about your learners and how you're supporting them. So although there has to be some referencing in this piece of work, if you can relate that to your own learners, so much the better. A reflective journal entry would be good to show at the end of the day, and we've made a start on that by thinking about what our view is on inclusion, and we'll reflect on that again later. So if we can improve our reflective practice, that'll be all to the good. So this is a big unit. There are a lot of criteria, and I've taken a slightly different approach with this unit based on some feedback I had from Joe. And so I'm going to show you what the whole unit is rather than the task for today, and we'll see how you feel about that. My concern was always that showing you the whole unit can feel a bit overwhelming, especially on a large unit. So I tended to only show people what they had to do today. In discussion with Joe, I've changed my mind about that, and I'm going to show you what the whole unit is. So maybe I would like your feelings on how you respond to both of those things. So this is really what we're seeing on the screen now is task A. There are 3 tasks, and task A splits down into 2 halves. And all I would normally show you is task A part 1, because that's what we're going to do today. Task A part 2 is what we'll look at next week. Task B the week after, and task C the week after that. So just have a read through and let me know. Obviously, we're going to cover all of this in detail, but let me know if you have any initial thoughts or concerns about anything that's on the screen, anything that triggers a thought, I wonder what that means and how we're likely to do that. Hey, am I okay to move on?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So that's task A, which we'll spend 2 weeks doing. This is task B. Part C there is probably the oddest one of all, where we have to look at how communication and strategies to provide support to students actually works or doesn't work in the organisation. That's what Part C is about. That raise any questions about Task B? Or can I move on? Okay, and then finally then Task C. You'll see the usual criteria appear in there in Task C that finish every unit on this qualification, and that's to review the effectiveness of, and so it's inclusive practice this time, and identify your strengths and areas for improvement. So those two little criteria appear at the end of every single unit. This one's a bit stronger though this time, because it's got an E, which is about producing an action plan to identify how you're going to improve your inclusive practice. And part of that, reviewing the effectiveness of your own practice will be for you to create a little quiz, a questionnaire, a survey for one of the groups that you teach around your inclusive practice, and use the results of that survey in order to produce the plan. Identify your strengths and areas for improvement and identify the plan to improve. But that's a ways off yet. So there we go. That's the entirety of the unit. I don't know if there's any thoughts from anybody on your preference in terms of whether I expose the entire unit content to you, well, that'd be myself and Joe, obviously, or whether you prefer just to focus on what you need to do today. Any thoughts at all?
Gary, I think it was good that we can see the whole thing, because if we got to Task C and we realised we'd started some of that perhaps during Task A or B, I can see why Joe probably thought to share the whole as a whole. I find that quite useful, so I'm not repeating myself.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
I agree, because when you're doing your research for the first couple of parts, you've got one eye on the future as well. So you might be able to squirrel away some things that will be useful later.
Sure. Yes. Good point. Good point. So that will go down as one of my improves then to switch to doing that, to taking that approach with future units. Just a reminder that these slides, the exact copy of these slides are on OneFile Resources under Unit 8 Task A. So if you ever need to refer back to these, then you'll find a copy of the PowerPoint there that you can go back to. Great. Okay. So we'll focus in then on Task A for today. And in particular, we'll focus on the first 3 factors that have an impact on teaching, learning and assessment. So in total, your report needs to cover 6 factors. So that's personal, social, cultural, cognitive, physical and sensory. But we're going to focus for the first half of the session on personal, social and cultural factors that impact upon learning. And we've got a little, I'm hoping what's come up on your screen now is a sign that's saying tap or click to open this website. Yep, okay, so if you just follow that instruction, then I'm guessing you'll need to, it'll ask you to enter your name. And if you can do that, we're using an app here called WordWall, which I've embedded within Nearpod, and you've got a little matching activity to do when you get in. One thing to bear in mind with the matching activity is that you'll be looking at social and personal factors that, or you'll be looking at all 3. You'll be looking at personal, social and cultural factors that impact on learning. And you've got to match all of the words there with either personal, social or cultural. Bear in mind that they're not equally distributed. In fact, there's one factor that will take the majority of those factors there. One issue that will take the majority of those factors. So don't feel that you need to distribute them equally. You'll find that there's one that will have all of those squares full, and the other two will still have some gaps. So don't feel you've got to distribute them. Don't guess by doing that. Just go with your gut and think, well, where does that truly belong? Has everybody got to the screen okay where you've got the matching activity? Yeah, okay, right. I'll leave you to have a go at that then. So just as a review then for that little activity, in terms of personal factors, these are some of the personal factors that can have a significant influence on how well a learner performs in our classrooms. All things really, which we have no control over. They're all known as personal factors. So that's a list of personal factors. Social factors. Please, as always, leap in if you've got any thoughts or comments on any of them. Geographic location can have a huge influence on the expectations of learners. And obviously, Harlow, it's an interesting reflection on the difference between Harlow and Stansted Airport colleges, really, in terms of the catchment area. Harlow, which is a recognised area of deprivation and certain social and housing issues and employment issues that Harlow has, whereas the Stansted Airport College has a much, much larger catchment area, and that has an influence on the expectations and cultural differences. So social factors, and then lastly cultural factors, which is what we're going to drill down a little bit more deeply on. Again, if you need to come back to these slides are on OneFile resources. So we're going to switch now to somebody else's PowerPoint presentation. This is This is an excerpt. The full set of slides are on OneFile Resources. I've just taken a few slides out of this PowerPoint from Professor Vijay. With his permission, I've been in touch with him and had his permission to use this. He's a dean at the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges. And one of the things that he teaches in there is he teaches the teachers of GPs and doctors, particularly around cultural differences and the impact that can have on learning. So I've pinched a few of these slides. Always difficult to deliver somebody else's material, but I'll try my best to do it justice. Professor Vijay's got lots of videos on YouTube as well, which you can have a look at. But he has based a lot of his work around Hofstede's cultural dimensions, of which there are 6. It's not immediately apparent, it certainly wasn't to me anyway, what the 6 meanings are in his 6 dimensions there. But I've downloaded and put on OneFile Resources detailed explanations of what each one of those cultural dimensions are. But essentially, Gerhard Hofstede, Professor Gerhard Hofstede, set up a group, a global research group, to look at how cultural differences impact on learning. And so he had to establish a model, really, to identify how are we going to measure the differences in cultural values and beliefs. And so these are the 6 dimensions that he came up with. We're not going to look at all of them. We're going to pick on 3 in particular. So I'll try my best to give you a more detailed explanation of what they are. If you are interested in his work, he does have his group has its own website, and the link to that is also on OneFile Resources if you wanted to drill down further on that. But these are the ones that Professor Vijay looked at in terms of how it will impact in the teaching of GPs and doctors in hospitals. And so he picked on 3 in particular to look at where the differences are quite large. And this is not comparing all countries, of course. We're just restricting this to China, India, Nigeria, and the United Kingdom. So the first one that he was interested in is power distance. Power distance it's the cultural distance between an individual and somebody in power. So perhaps, if you think about the relationship that you have with your manager in the UK, generally, there are exceptions, but generally very often managers are treated as colleagues, more so in some cultures than in others. But in other cultures, the distance between you and your manager is very, very great. They are seen as somebody very, very distant, very remote, somebody to be respected and not to be challenged or to disagree with, but to be obedient towards and to follow relentlessly. And so this is where culture is different, and you can see there's quite a significant distance or difference in between the power distance of the UK and the power distance of the other 3 countries in question. I think in actual fact in China, I believe in their culture, the most expensive present that you buy for celebrations is the one that you buy for your employer, your manager. So, and then your family comes second unto that. And so they have a great power distance. Your MP, for example, do you think you could go along and talk to your MP or a political representative? Do you think you could go and talk to Karen, our principal, and have a discussion with her? Could you go and disagree with her about things? And then think about what other cultures are like. Out of interest, would anybody like to take a guess, as it's not on there, at the country that has the largest power distance in the globe around the world? Which country do you think has the biggest distance between its people and its leaders?
North Korea?
Yeah, that'd be a good example, wouldn't it? Yeah, that'd be a good example. Yeah, I don't know exactly where they come, North Korea. I haven't seen them on the scale, but yeah, that would be an excellent example. Yeah.
I would guess Japan.
Yeah, I haven't seen where Japan is. Yeah, that would be another example because it's you know, it's an east-west type divide, isn't it? Yeah. And again, I think the Japanese, they revere their managers and employers and their emperor and their leaders. Yeah.
Iran,
Yeah, that would be another good one. That would be another good one.
and Russia.
Russia, that's the one. That's the one. I think it's something like I think it might even be 90% on the scale. And I think it's even higher than that. It might be something like 96%. So Russia has the largest power distance. Anybody think about what the lowest one might be, the smallest power distance, which is, I think, it's less than half the UK's power distance. It's in Europe. Well, kind of.
Monaco.
No, that'd be an interesting one. That would be a good one to look at.
It's somewhere like Sweden.
Yeah, it is. It's Denmark.
Yeah.
It's
that's what I
Denmark.
was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. It's those kind of countries where they, looking at that masculinity scale, they're also very feminine countries. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, they all have. They score very low on masculinity, very high on femininity, and their power distance is extremely low. Which, you know, as countries makes them quite effective because their communication is much better for that. So yeah, power distance. It's the kind of relationship that you have with a subordinate would have with a manager. It's the relationship you have with leaders, managers, politicians. So then he also looked at individualism, which it's really about how a country views the importance of the individual and their own actions versus the importance of collective action. And you can see again, between the three countries that we're looking at here, that there's huge distance between the UK and the Eastern countries that we're looking at, China, India, and Nigeria, where particularly with China, collective action, the collective, the good of the community is far greater than outweighs the importance of the individual in there. And that's sort of how cultures view things. Masculinity, there's not a huge difference between across the four cultures there. Uncertainty avoidance, that's about how cultures view uncertainty, whether they sort of welcome it and live with it and accept it as the norm, or whether they try and avoid it. And there's kind of there's not that much difference between there. Another large difference, though, is long-termism. You know, how a country and a culture views the long term and the short term. You can see there's, although there's not a great deal of difference between us and India, there is between us and China and us and Nigeria. So those are the three that he focused on. Indulgence versus restraint, I suppose, is the opposite of indulgence. There's quite a large difference again there. But the three that he focused on, Professor Vijay, in terms of teaching and learning, power distance, individualism, and long-termism are the three that he mainly focused in on there. And just to give you, think about why we're looking at that, how does it impact on what we do as teachers? Just to give an example here, in looking at China, we are supposed to, well, we're required to, it's part of the funding that we get from central government office, and it's something that Ofsted look at how we're doing, is we are expected to teach in schools and colleges British values, and we're supposed to embed them in our classes. Whereas if we compare that with China, which is the thing there called Zhuangzi, and Zhuangzi is national learning. It's something that all children are taught in every year of their education. It's the four principles, the four values of Chinese culture. So this is taught, and if you compare that to sort of the British values, you know, you've got perhaps duty before freedom, whereas we've got individual liberty. So it's the focus on, you know, the rights of the individual, whereas they've got duty before freedom, they've got obedience before rights. So as we're playing sort of on the respect and tolerance, the rights of the individual and democracy, you know, you balance that against duty before freedom, obedience before rights, community before the individual. It's almost sort of the opposite, harmony before conflict. I suppose, you know, you've got obedience before rights. You could say, well, that aligns with rule of law. A society has to have some kind of rules in place in order to sort of be a civilized group of people. But this is, you know, we're not saying, you know, one is right and one is wrong. They're different. And it's when we live in a diverse culture and we put all these people in one room together, these people bring these values into the room with them, and it has an impact on the way they interpret information and the way they engage with the type of learning. So obviously, you know, we teach based on our culture, and so we need to be aware of our own culture. And we need to have an awareness of other cultures as well, and how our culture, the way we teach, might influence and impact the quality of the learning of people from other cultures. So thinking about power distance, you know, in terms of how that might affect things in the classroom, you know, somebody from a country that had a large power distance, if they were a teacher, they would predominantly deliver by teacher-led approaches. And students who are from a culture that has a large power distance would expect the teacher to lead the class. They would expect to have very little input or control on the lesson. They wouldn't contradict or criticize the teacher, because that would be against their culture. So, you know, talking about, discussing, challenging group work, what do you think? What are your opinions? What would you do? Are not really valued or understood necessarily by somebody who comes from a culture that has a large power distance. Again, you know, with the small power distance, teachers do expect initiatives from students in class, whereas teachers from countries with a large power distance probably wouldn't. So this is how it can impact upon both the teacher, the way the teacher approaches lessons, and what the expectation of the learner is. So you might find that, you know, you've got students for different reasons. There are other reasons as well, other than culture, other than learning, you know, you've got learning difficulties and challenges as well, as why a student might avoid speaking up, sharing their views, contradicting the teacher, questioning the teacher if they didn't understand. So then the individualism, and the opposite of that is the sort of collectivism. And you can see sort of the differences in cultures there. And the collectivism, again, sort of falling down this route of unquestioning. So not challenging the teacher, not questioning, well, where did that come from and who said that and why is that the case? Which is really sort of what we're trying to get our students to think. There's obviously references to doctors throughout Vijay's PowerPoint, because he's talking about the teaching of doctors. And also they're noting that, you know, the difference in doctors being more and less assertive with their patients in their particular case. And then the last one that we looked at there was the uncertainty avoidance, which the thing that I got you to do at the very beginning really is to think about your feelings, how you're feeling today. But in cultures where they have a low uncertainty avoidance, expression of feelings is not considered important. But they do have more tolerance of different opinions. And teachers aren't expected to have all the answers. Whereas high uncertainty avoidance, the expectation is for highly structured lessons. Teachers do have all the answers. And there's less attention given to building rapport with students. Something that we stress is highly important in our teacher training program. Building rapport with your learners is something we consider to be highly important, but we also need to recognize that there are cultures where that isn't expected. It's not the expectation and not the norm. Even within the UK, if you move around the country, different counties, different parts of the country have different cultures on what's expected in terms of building rapport and the relationship between students and teachers. So just reviewing sort of all of that, but you know, Professor Vijay is saying essentially you need to be aware of your own culture and your own values and how that influences the way you teach. And also the assumptions you make about others and their behavior and how they interact with you. And, you know, that awareness of stereotyping and perhaps your unconscious biases, which, because, you know, people say, oh, you need to be aware of your unconscious biases, but if they're unconscious, because how do you become aware of them? Is always the challenge. This was a slide that he'd included in there on microaggressions, which can be intentional, but more often are unintentional discrimination. Strange term, microaggressions. They're referred to as aggressions, but you know, I think in the majority of cases, it's an unintentional discrimination. And this doesn't just relate to culture either, of course. It can relate to disability and to gender and to sexual preferences. Joe was telling me that another member of staff held the door open for her when she was walking around the college. And then that member of staff said to her, oh, I hope you don't think that was a microaggression because I held the door open for you. And Joe said, well, no, it wasn't. She said, but the fact that you've mentioned it might be. So again, I think it's just an awareness, really, of the nature of interaction across cultures and language barriers. And, you know, people from different cultures and whose first language isn't English, it can appear, as the third bullet point says, there can appear awkward or difficult or slow to learn. It can make them appear less intelligent or perhaps lack sense of humor, which is a completely different, their humor is very, very different to ours. And so we can make judgments on people just based on their different cultures about their ability to learn and their intelligence, which aren't accurate. So we just need to have an awareness really of that. And this slide just is another example of that. If you imagine, I don't know, going to a country where it's your second language, or the culture is very different, you know, you can have these concerns about, I'm worried that they'll think I'm stupid, so therefore I won't speak up. Was it Mark Twain who said, best to be silent and allow people to think yourself stupid than open your mouth and leave them in no doubt? I think that was Mark Twain, wasn't it? Yeah. But taking that example aside, it is safer sometimes not to ask questions, because you think, actually, these people seem to know a lot more than me. They're more fluent than me. I don't fully understand what they're talking about, so I'm not going to ask a question. And the same thing, fearing incompetence. Thinking about Paul and Steph, your industry in particular, in the airline industry, human factors is this massive issue, isn't it? And the need to speak to somebody if you feel you've made a mistake or a mistake has been made. It's imperative that if something has gone wrong, you need to speak to somebody about it before that situation escalates.
It's called Just Culture. So
Right.
it's I'm talking to the students about it now so that they're aware and that they understand that if you make a mistake, you need to own up to it immediately. And then by owning up to it immediately, there is no consequence to it, mostly.
Yeah.
You'll be forgiven of your transgression. But let's say you damaged an aircraft in some way, you've damaged the aircraft, but you choose not to make managers aware of it. That aircraft then takes off and has an accident, then yeah, you'll obviously be treated extremely harshly. Whereas if you do something, you damage the aircraft, you put your hands up straight away and you admit to your mistake, then you'll be dealt with leniently.
Yeah. Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. So, that it's the culture of aviation is the admission of mistakes is crucial to being competent in that role. And culture can potentially be a barrier to that, because it looks like it's admitting a weakness. People don't want to criticize because they're afraid that they might be seen as negative if they question or criticize. They're concerned about seeing as being a negative person, and for the same reason, they might worry about being seen as being disruptive to a lesson, so that they don't speak up. Idioms are something we need to be aware of all of the time. I think some of these obviously are particularly used as in medical. I guess there's a number 1 and a number 2 there, which probably come up quite a lot in medicine. The only one I know that I use is Bob's your uncle. I do say that quite a lot, and as soon as it comes out of my mouth in terms of when I'm at work, I know that's I shouldn't have said that. But we all have them, I guess, our own idioms that we use, and it's just trying to avoid them really, because they are UK culture, and some of them are even specific to certain areas of the country. Just as an interesting piece of history, does anybody know where codswallop came from?
I would hazard a guess at Shakespeare, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it might well have been quoted in Shakespeare. I think cods, I believe cods was a beer. And I think, from what I remember, cods made this beer, and they sold sort of what was the dregs of the barrel out of the brewing tuns. When they cleaned them out, they would scrape out the dregs from the bottom, and they bottled that, and it was known as wallop. And then it was sold as a really cheap alcohol called codswallop. So it was a very, very poor product, I believe. I think that's where it's come from, but please feel free to do some research and break with cultural tradition and disagree with me. This I found quite amusing because it made me really think about how I use language in feedback.
So from this list, I take it that I'm not British.
No, you don't use any of that then, Carolyn? Or
No,
do you mean different things?
No, I don't. When I say those things, that's not what I mean.
No,
So,
well, it worried me because I do say some of those things in feedback, and I think I'm sure that's not really what I mean. You know, quite good. I don't think I usually mean that's a bit disappointing.
no, I mean, I hear what you say all the time, and I do mean I accept your point of view.
Yeah.
Not I disagree. Although, however, when I say with the greatest respect, I do quite often think that the person is an idiot. So.
Yeah. But yeah, it's an interesting take. I mean, you know, this is one person's opinion, one person's view, and you know, it was interesting, I think, for me to read that, and it just kind of made me think about how I use, because there's probably several things I use in there in terms of feedback. So I would suggest quite good. You know, I've said and written about disappointment. I don't necessarily think I'm annoyed, or at least I hope I'm not, but you know, I probably need to review the language that I'm using, possibly as a result of that. I'll certainly reflect on it a little more anyway. I like the statement, so I kept this particular slide in. It's the best definition I think I've heard. I feel that that's very hard, almost impossible for a teacher to achieve, because you've got so many differences in a class, and so many of them are hidden from you. You learn as you go on with your group, you learn more and more about them, about what their barriers might be and how to remove them. But I was just thinking about myself in meetings. You know, I go to a lot of meetings in my role, and do I always feel that I can dance like no one's watching? You know, do I always feel that I can be my authentic self without fear of judgment? No, I don't. I go to training sessions, sometimes staff development sessions. I get sent on training courses. I go in meetings where I think, no, I won't say anything here. So obviously to feel like I don't belong. Maybe I sometimes have a bit of imposter syndrome. I don't know. Does anybody else feel that they can, you know, have that same feeling, or am I on my own there?
I think I've developed through that kind of journey, because I used to feel a lot of imposter syndrome all the time, and I didn't have the confidence to think that my ideas were actually valuable. And I thought, well, if it was a good idea, someone already would have had it. And I think I'm learning that that's not necessarily the case, and I can make a contribution.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's very much a journey.
It is, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it is a journey. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I think as I've got older, I've got better at just having that kind of beginner's mindset and caring a lot less about maybe what other people think, and just maybe just focusing on how I'm doing and then competing with the me of yesterday, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yes, it does.
And then by doing that, I don't mind if somebody thinks that I'm an idiot, because, you know, as time goes by, I'll just catch up with them. You know, they might only be a couple of chapters ahead of me in how to do whatever they're doing. And, you know, with hard work, I'll just end up, you know, tracking them down and catching them up.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Yeah, I don't think myself I will feel like with the belonging feelings, maybe related to the fear of judgment. I think that is linked. Sometimes, depending where you are with who you are, even though if you feel like, okay, I think I'm comfortable enough, but constantly got this kind of fear behind, like that's holding me back. And you don't want to end up look like a fool or or just give the wrong impression. But yeah, that's my feeling and my experience about this, I believe.
Yeah, sure. Yes,
Yeah.
thanks, Dave. Yeah, and we need to bear in mind that everything that you've just expressed, those are the feelings of our learners as well. When we stand up in front of them and say, has anybody got any questions? Does anybody like to ask anything? Do you all understand this? Those same feelings that we've just all shared are going through our learners as well, and with a lot less experience and a lot less maturity as well, in terms of the challenge we have to getting them engaged and discussing and talking is it's a thing. This fear of what other people think of us is learned as we get older. In young children, they don't care what other people think. They'll just say and act the way that they want to. But we're working with adolescents in the main, and in adolescence, they're really in the thick of learning that period. They're coming into adulthood. They're in the thick of that time when they're really quite concerned about what other people think of them and coming to terms with that. So we've got them probably at one of the most difficult times in terms of getting them to engage and group discuss and work collectively. I years ago we did some in the engineering team. We went out and did some work in some schools, and I was really shocked at how the behaviour was so much different in secondary schools. That that they would just get stuck in and have a go, and there was a lot less worry about what other people in the group thought about them. So it's kind of a learned thing, and then we kind of have to unlearn it again as we mature. But it's certainly something we need to be aware of.
Gary, I know that we're pressed for time, but can I just contribute one other thing?
Yeah, please do.
I found that was really handy. And again, this is just around mindset and how powerful just reading the right book can be. So I read a book by Carol Dweck about mindset, and then kind of went about implementing some of the things that she had talked about. And within my group, that group that you were observing the other day, I spoke to them about this idea of failure, and that it's actually a good thing. If we come across something and you don't know, that's actually great. Like when you were a toddler, you were learning how to walk. You had to go from that transition period where you were crawling to then when you were walking, but you constantly made mistakes to get to that point. You didn't just transition and it was easy. You probably fell over, you probably even banged your head. Your parents did their very best to try and help you, but you would have failed. But that's okay, and it's a good thing if you fail, because that shows me that you're pushing the envelope rather than just residing in that area where you're in your comfort zone. And to kind of add even more to that, with my own child now, I actually try and get her to tell me once a week something that she's failed at, and rather than it be a shame to the family, it's celebrated, because that then means that you are truly trying your very best and you're failing, but then through failing, that's how you then get to the next level. And then by doing that, with my own kid and with my students, I think that there's a very low stakes culture at the moment. You're allowed to do something. You can say something and it's wrong, but that's cool, because we'll adjust it, we'll move on, and we'll find the right answer amongst ourselves. And I think that as adolescents, they're really aware of not wanting to fail or being seen to fail in front of teachers or their peers, and that being the most awful thing that can happen. But actually, the most awful thing that could happen is that you get to that point where you die and you haven't achieved your potential because you were too scared. So it's trying to just unpick that fear and then, turn it into an opportunity to learn. Yeah, absolutely. And I would always go out of my way to praise a learner if they said they didn't understand something, because I think what a wonderful thing that is, because now there's two of us who know exactly where we stand. Before, I thought everybody understood this,
and you clearly didn't, and we had a different view of this situation. But now we're looking at the same picture. Now we can do something about it because we've got a shared understanding of where we are. So I'll always, really make a big effort to praise a student who says, I didn't understand something. Because now we can do something about it. We couldn't have done anything about fixing that if we hadn't brought that up. Yeah.
It's almost like having a safety net as well. So, at the end of you'll ask us, for instance, do you have any questions? And, nobody will say anything. And then you'll move to the next thing. Does anybody have any questions? And the whole time we're then believing like we can build on this because you're telling me that you completely understand everything. But, yeah. I guess it's also I give my students the out as well of, you can talk to me after the lesson, or you can email me. And then my feedback at the end of the lessons, like yesterday, I asked them directly, is there anything that you don't understand? If you needed to teach this, could you teach it? And they all that they were happy, give them and all you can do is that, right? You just keep offering to help. Like, if you don't know, ask me. I want to help you. At the end of the day, you getting a good grade is what I'm after.
Absolutely. It's creating that environment, isn't it, in the classroom, where the safe to fail environment. And the mindset of it being a positive thing rather than a negative thing, I think, is something that we all have to work hard at continuously. This is another of Professor Vijay's slides there. I just left it in because I thought it was quite a nice definition of inclusion. There's no challenge or denial of their identity, of who and what they are. Shared respect, shared meaning, shared knowledge, shared experience of learning. And I think, to some extent, the UK culture is one of competition. I know there was a huge amount of criticism 10, 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, when they started on sports days, sort of they stopped awarding prizes and putting importance on races of people coming first. That might have been taking things too far, but what they're trying to do in education was saying, we're all different, we're all at different places, but actually if we work together, we can achieve a lot more together if we're supportive of each other rather than if we're competitive with each other. There's no scarcity of success. It's not like, I understand this, I've got 10 out of 10 on this test, but I'm not going to help anybody else because then they might be as good as me and then I won't look so good. It's this mentality of success is scarce, and if I win something, if I do something, I've got to hold on to it. I can't help my neighbor because then they might be better than me and I'll be second instead of being first. And that is kind of endemic in British culture of competition. And in business, there is an element of that, but there's also, you can be successful in a collaborative business as well. But in a learning environment, we need to have that culture of collaboration rather than the one of competition. So we're sort of drawing out of this, talking about trust. That's the trust between the teacher and the students, and the kind of trust that the teachers engenders in the classroom. That relationship, the rapport with the learner, spending time to getting to know the students, and the importance of the teacher being a role model, and that even the Jeff Petty definition of inclusion about the Medland mission feedback and corrective actions for every learner appropriate to their individual needs. And this was his last slide. I've just jumped to the last slide in his PowerPoint, which is, this is a message that he's sending out to the teachers of doctors and GPs. It's not the individual that's broken, it's the system. So we need to try and correct the system. And then there was a little activity he had on there. So that really concludes Professor Vijay's view of the cultural impact on the ability to learn. You don't have to use this work, but I found it I had a discussion with Professor Vijay. I really liked what he's doing and where he's coming from. It made sense to me. Use of the Hofstede model looked like a logical approach to measuring the differences on cultural impact. It looked like the whole thing looked like a sound and logical approach. So I've borrowed it in terms of what the cultural impact is on learning. So let's have 2 minutes now just to go back to your original belief on what inclusion meant to you. Just sit and have a reflect on that for a couple of minutes. See if it's altered at all, or see if you think, well, actually, no, I think I pretty much got that right, or maybe there's something additional you want to add to it. And then you can use the whole thing as your reflective journal entry for this week. If we just drill down now, then a little bit more on the first of 2 reports that you need to write for task A, and sort of put some more flesh on the bones, so to speak. So the requirement is to review the impact on personal, social, and cultural factors, different cognitive, physical, and sensory abilities. So you've got 6 in total. Now, the guidance, and bear in mind this is only guidance from the awarding organisation, is 1,000 to 1,500 words. That's 1 to 2 sides of A4 at 12-point font. They're suggesting that you have at least 3 references to a theory and include a bibliography. But I'm also saying, you know, what I would add more value to is if you've got examples of learners whose learning has been affected by personal, social, cultural, cognitive, physical, or sensory abilities, either currently that you're working with or in the past, then it would be great to make reference to those and how that impact, how it impacted upon their learning, and what actions, intervention has been taken to support the learner. So the key term here, the assessment to the term, is review, the word review. It says review the impact of. So what does that actually mean? Well, it's kind of breaking it down, the subject, a critical examination of the subject. So a summary of what the impact might be, and if you've got an example that you can relate to, then to bring that into play. Otherwise, you could just discuss the theory around it, and what the potential intervention would be, the support that would be brought into play in order to support that particular learner. With your opinion, because you know, you are allowed to voice your opinion and your experience with your own students in here. Now, to keep this sort of manageable, you know, to keep it sort of within 2 sides of A4, what I'm going to suggest you do is, in your review, I would consider no more than 2 personal factors, no more than 2 social factors, no more than 2 cultural factors. So limit it to 2 personal, 2 social, and 2 cultural. And then for the next 3, I would limit it to 1, because they can have a substantially larger impact. So 1 cognitive, 1 physical, and 1 sensory. And we'll have a look at what those could be on the next slide. What questions does that raise for you now in terms of Unit 8, Task A, for the first report?
I'm not sure if it's really related to that, Gary, but there is, in this, when I look at this, there is one word, and I think I've tried before to find a simple explanation. The word cognitive.
Oh, yeah.
cognitive. I'm sorry, it's just because again, I've got to understand the proper meaning on some words that I don't use often. So cognitive to me is always being like a word that I'm not really sure, it's blurry. What does it really mean in simple terms, if you don't mind? I'm sorry about, holding you on for this, but
Yeah, no, don't absolutely don't be sorry, Steph, because being sorry is one of the barriers that we've just talked about.
yeah.
It's that that the feeling, the need to apologize for asking that question. No, it's a complex word, and probably if you looked it up, you could find as many different definitions of that word as there are as there are websites for it. To put it in simple terms, I would say it's the working of the mind, the way the mind attains new knowledge, the learning process of the mind, if you like.
Okay.
The word, you can find bits of the word in other language, like, for example, like recognition, so recognition. So I recognize this, I recognize this piece of text. So in other words, there's a memory stored somewhere that you've seen this before. It's in the mind, and seeing it again, there's recognition of it, although we call it recognition, it's recognition. So there's that aspect of it. There's another term you say is, are you cognizant with this, with this aircraft? So in other words, are you familiar, with how this aircraft works? So it's about the learning and the storage of knowledge and understanding, and the way that the mind processes from the senses. So what we see, what we hear, what we read, what we smell, what we taste, what we touch, our external senses give us information, and the mind processes that information and creates meaning for it and then stores it. And it's the process between the senses and the storage is cognition.
Okay.
And feel free for like anybody else's definition of cognition. Please join in that debate of what cognition means to you.
So to me, I'm instantly thinking of students who are neurodiverse. So when it talks about different cognition, I'm thinking about students with autism or ADHD or epilepsy, those sorts of students. So that's what I'm thinking of when I see that word.
Yeah, that's right. It's that students who present with those kind of conditions would process information from the senses into the mind in a different way, potentially. Yeah. Does that help, Steph?
Oh, it does very much.
Yeah.
That's what I needed, because you've provided example, a simple definition of the word, which makes more sense now than when I was trying to read it on a dictionary or online or whatever. So yeah, thank you very much. It has definitely helped. Yeah.
Good, excellent. And thank you for the question. As often I always say to students, when you ask one question, actually you're probably doing the rest of the whole group a favor, because they're nobody understands it, but nobody's got the courage to ask. And so there's that one person who asks, and everybody says, oh, I'm glad they asked that, because I didn't understand it either. Okay, wonderful. Right. Okay, so I think at 11 o'clock it would be a good point for us to take a break, because we've covered an awful lot in quite a short space of time, and it's quite a heavy material. Something maybe to go away and think about. We'll look at what factors could come under cognitive, physical and sensory when we come back after break. Hopefully we've reasonably well covered personal. You've got a nice long list, and you can add to that from your own experience with your students. Social, you've got a good long list there, and you can add from your own experience. Cultural, we've covered quite extensively, and again, you can talk about your own experience. based on your own culture and background and that of your students. And then we'll have a look at some examples from the other three after we come back from break. So yeah, take 15 minutes. I'll throw a timer up on the screen and we'll meet back here in 15. Let's pause the recording as well. So looking at the second three, and where I'm suggesting you only consider one from each factor. These are not an exhaustive list, but typical perhaps factors that would impact on learning. So under cognitive, things that would impact on a student's ability to process new information is dyslexia, by far the most common right the way across the entire college. And that can manifest itself in lots of different ways. So it needn't necessarily always be about reading and writing. It can be about organizational ability and structuring as well. Dyscalculia, autism, anxiety, which is prevalent in our young people, particularly so since the pandemic. Asperger's syndrome, ADHD and ODD, oppositional defiance disorder, are amongst some of the common ones that we see in students across the college, but there are others. In terms of physical, probably the most common one that we've got is probably through trauma or accident or illness of a physical disability, cerebral palsy. We have several students each year generally with cerebral palsy. And lower limb mobility, so wheelchair enabled, wheelchair users. We always have a few wheelchair users. Fine motor control issues, which dyspraxia, sometimes that's known as well. And for sensory, the top two are visual and hearing impairments, which can obviously vary in severity. Spatial awareness, smell, taste, and touch are also possibilities, but very much rarer. Not always impacting on learning necessarily, depending on what the subject matter is. The one student I had a good few years back with I don't know what that was. I guess it was a cognitive. Yes, I suppose it must have been a cognitive learning difficulty. It was never diagnosed, but in engineering, reading engineering drawings is a critical part of the subject, and you can get sort of 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional engineering drawings. And this student was completely unable to visualize a component or a part based on its drawings. The lines to this student were just lines on a piece of paper. They had no meaning. They were completely unable to interpret those lines into a physical part. So if I gave the student a drawing and I then gave them, say, 10 components, and said, okay, we'll pick out which one of those components this drawing represents, they would be entirely unable to do that. It was like a drawing version of dyslexia, if you like. It's a very, very strange barrier that the student had, and it was really difficult to find ways around that. So obviously, reading and interpreting engineering drawings are a critical aspect of engineering. But that was sort of an undiagnosed cognitive learning disability or difficulty. So again, they say they're not exhaustive lists, but they are probably lists of some of the most common ones. I'm not going to give you any input on these because my knowledge of these is not sufficiently good for me to be able to do it. We have got a recording, a video recording. It's an hour long from Shauna Buckley in the Supported Studies Department. And she kindly gave, I think, the last level 5 group that went through. She delivered a session to them, which we've recorded, and we've got that recording, and I've put that onto OneFile Resources. She also delivered a shorter version of it more recently on the teaching project. So if any of you have watched that, then there's that as well, which is still on Shobi. Otherwise, there's Shauna's recording on there. Just before we move on, any questions around the cognitive, physical and sensory factors? Okay. So research sources, if you do have a copy of the Bob Bates Learning Theory Simplified, there are a plethora of references that you could use in there. So for personal and social barriers, there's all of those theorists that you could make reference to. I've given you so many because I don't expect you to use that many. It's just that you can use which one you can relate to, really, one that you like, one that means something to you. So all of those are around personal and social factors that impact on learning. They're all theorists that have written about that. And down at the very bottom, I've also got Professor John Hattie's effect sizes. So Professor Hattie has carried out a lifelong piece of research that's still going on. It's global as well, about what factors have the most impact on learning. Mostly it's around what happens in the classroom. But there's a website where you can look them up and there's an interpretation of them. I'll put the link in OneFile Resources if it interests you. But some of the factors that impact on student learning, of course, are home factors and out of school factors. So if you want to, you can go to this website and you can click on home, or you can click on technology and out of school. And you can then drill down to what all the factors are. You can even put filters on to see if it accelerates learning or decelerates learning, whether it has a positive or a negative impact, and how significant an impact it has. So you could use that if you wanted to. Professor John Hattie's effect sizes, that's another source. For cultural factors, you've got one reference in the Bob Bates book. I've also put the full copy of Professor VJ's slides onto OneFile Resources, and there's also a link on there to Yicha Ofstede as well, and his research. So you've got some options with cultural there. For cognitive, you've got one reference in Bob Bates of Singer, and then you've got Shauna. Her video is on there. You can use Shauna as a reference if you want to, and her copy of her slides are also on OneFile Resources. And for sensory and physical, I've put several web links on there. And I've also downloaded, there's a set of further education national standards for supporting students with physical disabilities. I've put that on there. That was created by the Education Training Foundation. So that's also on there. I think there are a couple of other web links I've put on there as well for sensory and physical disabilities as well. Report 2. So right, okay, that's us done for this morning then, really. So that leaves us with an hour. Let's just take that share down now for the moment. I just quickly want to show you, hopefully you know your way around one file now, but just in case, and for the benefit of those watching on the recording. If you go to OneFile Resources, which is the little filing cabinet down the outside, or if you've got the text switched on, it actually says Resources next to the little filing cabinet. Click on that, and then you go to Learner Resources and Level 5 Diploma, Unit 8 Inclusive Practice. Here's the full assignment brief. So the first 3 slides that we looked at with task A, B, and C on them, you can have a look in there. That's the full assignment brief. Or if you click on task A, this PowerPoint here is an exact copy of the Nearpod that we've just worked through. And because task A has got 2 parts to it, report 1 and report 2, I've put separate folders to keep the information separate on there. So the impact of factors and abilities, if we go into that folder, there's a good long list of resources there that you can use. Shauna's video, which if you haven't seen Shauna's video, if you were on the teaching project and you've seen it, you might not want to watch it because it's quite similar. If you were on the teaching project and didn't get to see it, or you haven't been on the teaching project, then I would suggest it's well worth looking at, and that link is there. So that will take you to a YouTube video, a recording. It's 1 hour long, and that's of Shauna going through what the impact and barriers are for the most common neurodivergent conditions that you might well come across in mainstream colleges. And she also talks about what the mitigating things are that you can do to minimize the impact of learning. But there are lots of other links on there for physical and for sensory. Who also got Hofstede's Cultural Differences Explained. There's a full copy of Professor Vijay's presentation there. Some other documents on what are cognitive learning difficulties, and a copy of Sean's PowerPoint there. So there's a nice lot of resources there that you should hopefully be able to make use of for referencing. In addition to, if you've got Bob Bates, if you've got the Level 5 Diploma in Education Training Handbook, the textbook, there's a very small reference in there to inclusive practice. I think it's only about a page, but there might be something in there you can use, but there's not a great deal in that book in terms of inclusive practice, because this inclusive practice, Unit 8, is an optional unit. Obviously, that book covers only the mandatory units, and this is an optional one. So I'm reasonably confident that you, by the end of today, you should either have this first report finished or very nearly finished. Because if you just limit yourself to 2 of the first 3 and 1 out of the second 3 set of factors, you should be able to get that completed today, hopefully within the lesson time. That's my hope anyway, a target set for you. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to, I think what I'll do is I'll give you 5 minutes on your own to have a think about which one of the cognitive, physical and sensory disabilities that you might want to consider. So I'll put 5 minutes on the clock just for you to make some notes and think about, if you want to have a look at any of the resources you can in the first 5 minutes, and then I'll put you into some breakout rooms in groups, and so you can have an initial discussion between each other about which ones you're going to choose, why, what the potential barriers could be, and how learners could be supported with those, using sort of experience from your own classroom practice. The groupings I'm going to put, I might. Steph, did you get, because you weren't allowed to attend on Fridays, were you, during the teaching project? They didn't release you to attend the live sessions?
No, I didn't. The last thing I've watched was the video from Shona.
Oh, okay. So you have watched that.
I watched that on my own
Okay.
to catch up, and I
Right.
gave feedback on, was it a Shobi, and
Oh, yeah.
Kelly kind of acknowledged, but yeah, the last live session, I was double booked, so I just
Yes, sure.
it's,
Yeah.
and I did follow your advice the other day, and I did mention on Shobi, explain why I had missed so many sessions of it, because of the way that it has been organized and double booked at
Sure.
the same time than everything else, and
Yes. Yeah.
so people
Okay.
are aware, so at least, you know.
Yeah, that's fine, Steph. Yeah, no problem. Okay, well, in which case then what I might do in terms of grouping, we might just have 2 groups, and I might, I think, put Caroline, Paul, and Steph together, because you were all on the teaching project and have seen Shauna's video already, and Jen and Hayley I'll put together, because you might decide that you want to watch that video from Shauna first. So let's are we clear on what we're doing? Let's have 10 minutes, I think, actually 10 minutes on your own to just think through which one of the 3, which one of each one of the 3 you're going to look for. So a cognitive learning difficulty, a physical, and a sensory. I can put those examples back up on the screen if you want me to, whilst we're doing that. And 10 minutes just to think about that, and then we'll go into some breakout rooms, and you can share and discuss as to how you think that ought to be recorded in the assignment. Are we clear on the task? Fabulous. Okay. I'll set the timer running, and I'll share that last slide.